I swear I never imagined that a simple carelessness could become such an unexpected confession. But it happened. And look, it wasn't easy to pretend nothing was going on. It all started any day, normal like any other. I was in my room, changing myself, looking at me in the mirror, and of course, not imagining someone could enter. Only I was ugly. It was fast, but enough to change everything. The door suddenly opened, and there he was, Daniel, my nephew. I froze. He too. But the way he looked, oh, that look wasn't just a surprise. There was something else there, something I shouldn't have realized, but I felt it on time. He stood staring at me, the mouth ajar, the eyes down my body. I could only think, is he looking at me like that? My own nephew? And then, as if he got a trance, he stammered an excuse and left. But that image was in my head, and by the way, in his too, because after that day, nothing more was the same. After that day, something changed. First, I thought it was my head, but it WASN single quotes talked to look at me differently. At first, it was subtle, a longer look here, a deviation of look there. It was impossible to ignore. I tested, past him wearing a shorter shorts, a tighter blouse, and yes, he looked at me. He looked at me as a man looks at a woman. And I felt, but the worst, or the best, that's when he stopped hiding. "You're beautiful, aunt," he said one day, out of nowhere. So bluntly, my heart leaned. I laughed. I was aware of. I pretended I had nothing there. But I had. And increasingly, I knew that. And it wasn't just compliments. It was the eyes, the accidental touches, the corner smiles. Every little detail made me realize that he was testing, trying to understand how far I could go. And the problem, I left. I didn't go back. And the question I asked me now was, how far could I ignore? Daniel has always been a quiet boy at his, but after that day, it seemed that he had awakened to something new. The way he looked at me was no longer the same. In the beginning, it was just those time-consuming. He watched me when I thought I wasn't realizing it, but I realized more and more. And that was not all. He started to surround me. I always managed to be around, to pull conversation, to praise myself in ways I had never done before. "You're so different from girls my age." He let go once as he stared at me. I pretended I didn't understand, but my skin was already burning with that fixed look. His once innocent voice now seemed to have a tone loaded with second intentions. It was as if he was playing a game with me, testing my limits. And the worst, I felt he knew he was getting it. I tried to act normally, but inside I was a mess. Because, despite everything, my body reacted. My heart accelerated. My breathing was heavy. And then came the moment when I knew it was not just my head. He not only looked at me. He wanted me that the tension had been on the air for days. I felt Daniel's look at me, the way he came closer than necessary, as if he wanted to cross an invisible line. Until one night, he did just that. We were alone in the room, the TV on, but no one paid attention. He sat next to me, closer than he should. I could feel the heat of his body, the smell of the skin, the rhythm of breathing. So, without warning, he broke the silence. "You already realized I'm not a boy anymore, right?" I locked. Didn't expect that. My heart accelerated. My mind sought an answer. But before I said anything, he continued, "I always wanted someone like you. Since before, well, always, my breathing was stuck in the throat." Daniel was not kidding. It was not a loose comment. It was a confession. He stared at me without blinking, waiting for a reaction, the chest rising and down, his fingers restlessly on the couch. I could see in his eyes that he wanted more. I expected an answer. But what could I say? How to react? At that moment, I realized that the situation had come out of my control, and I didn't know if I wanted to resume this control or not. My head shouted that it was wrong, but my body betrayed every rational thought. I needed to get out, change the subject, pretend nothing happened. But my legs were heavy. My chest climbed and was fast. "Daniel, that can't happen." My voice came out weaker than I wanted. He smiled aside, that smile from who knows he's in control of the situation. He leaned, his eyes fixed on mine. "Can't or shouldn't." I swallowed hard. My whole body was on alert. Each cell told me that I should get up and leave. But I continued there. His hand brushed mine on purpose. It was a quick touch, but it made a shiver up my spine. I walked away at the same moment. I had to end that. No, that's it. It won't happen. My voice came firmly this time. He didn't insist, just looked at me, smiled again, and murmured, "What do you know? ... But when I got up and went to the room, my skin on fire. I knew I wasn't over. The next day, I tried to pretend that nothing had happened. But Daniel, he didn't let it. The looks continued, more intense, more direct, as if he knew he had touched something inside me, something I didn't want to admit. And the worst, I started to correspond. Without realizing it, my gaze took too long. At his, my heart beat faster when he entered the same room. My skin shivered when he passed close. It was a silent game, one that no one else saw. Just both of us. The small accidental touches began to seem intentional. He passed behind me and his hand slipped around my waist. Kay pretended to be unintentionally. Kay, but it wasn't. And then the whispers began. Kay, those low words that only I could hear. I know you feel too. I should have stopped that. It should have been firm. But the truth, I liked the sensation. I liked the danger, the tension, then it awakened in me. But secrets never are hidden for a long time. And someone was already beginning to notice. My sister, Daniel's mother, started to look at me differently, as if I knew something was out of place, and at that moment I realized that I had already let it go too far. The mood indoors began to change. My sister watched me in a strange way, as if I tried to understand something that made no sense to her. "It is good, too. You are a little different," she asked, looking deep into my eyes. My stomach rolled. I smiled, trying to look natural. "You're welcome. Just tired a lot in the head." She didn't seem convinced, but she didn't insist yet. But the truth, I was getting paranoid. Each time she entered the room, I held her breath. Each time Daniel approached too much, I felt her look at us, and Daniel. He seemed to like the danger. The more tense I was, the more it provoked. He went near me slowly, leaned over to speak in my ear. "Are you afraid of what, Aunt?" My skin burned. My heart pushed. I knew we were playing with fire. And then came the worst moment. My sister called me with a serious look, arms crossed. "I saw how Daniel looks at you. Is there anything happening that I should know?" The blood disappeared from my face. I froze. The game was about to end. My heart beat so hard that I could hear the sound in my ears. My sister was suspicious. She was seeing something. "But did you really know?" "What do you mean?" "The way he looks at me?" I tried to disguise how a man looks at a woman. Not like a nephew looks at his aunt. I swallowed. "You're imagining things." She was silent, studying me, trying to find some crack in my lie. I needed to be more careful. He needed to keep Daniel's distance. But he did not make it easier. That night, as I tried to avoid any contact, he appeared at the door of my room. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. My whole body was tense. "Daniel." "No. ... He approached with that look that disarmed me. Smell of his skin, the proximity, everything made me lose focus. "I just want to know the truth. Do you feel something for me?" I opened my mouth, but I couldn't answer. The air was heavy, loaded with something dangerous. The silence dragged on. And then he took a step more, close enough to feel his heat. I needed to escape. I needed to close that before it was too late. But did I want to close? Daniel was close, near enough to feel the heat of his body, the smell of the skin, the heavy breath. My body crashed. My mind shouted for me to step back, to end it there. But my legs didn't obey. "You didn't answer yet," he whispered, his eyes fixed on mine. My mouth dried up. My heart beat so hard that it seemed to echo in the whole room. I tried to speak, but my voice failed. Daniel lifted his hand slowly. It didn't touch me, but it was so close that I felt the energy between us both. My goosebumps, my breath, the air loaded with something I couldn't ignore. "If you don't want to, just say." I stopped now. I held my breath. It was my chance to get out of that situation, to put an end point, to show that I had control. But I hesitated, and he noticed. His gaze deepened, analyzing every detail of my expression, looking for a silent answer that I didn't even know if I wanted to give. "I know you feel." My whole body was alert. My heart fired. I needed to decide. There, at that very moment, and in that fraction of a second, I knew I was letting the game go too far. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to organize thoughts. My body wanted one thing. My mind shouted another. Daniel did not move away. He was still there, waiting for my answer. His gaze held me, and I felt the air becoming heavier and heavier. Tell me, Aunt, do you feel or don't feel? His voice was low, intense. My heart jumped in my chest. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to say that it was crazy, but I couldn't lie. This can't happen, I could finally say with a voice failing a little. He stepped back, but didn't seem convinced. His gaze still challenged me. Can't, or are you afraid of wanting? That question was in my head, because deep down I knew the answer. I hated myself for that. I wanted to put an end to that tension, but at the same time, my body reacted without me wanting. Daniel smiled in the corner, as if he knew what was going on in my head. I don't need an answer now, but I know what it is. He turned his back and left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I was being tested by the forbidden. And the worst, I liked the sensation, but something inside me still struggled. There was still a part of me that said to stop. Before it was too late, after all, could I deal with the consequences? The days passed, but the tension did not decrease. If before it was just a game of glances, now it was a loaded, dense silence, full of unbiased things, and my sister kept watching. I tried to act normally, but every time Daniel entered the same room as me, I felt the weight of her gaze on us. A simple touch, a look. Everything seemed to be more obvious to her until, on any afternoon, she got me by surprise. I saw you and Daniel yesterday. What is happening between you? Her voice sounded firm, bluntly. My heart fired. I could lie, could deny, but would she believe? You're imagining things. I tried to get out of the tangent, but she didn't seem convinced. She crossed her arms, looking straight into my eyes. I know my son. I know you. And I see when there is something wrong. My mouth dried up. The air seemed to disappear from the environment. She wasn't asking. She knew. Every second I took to answer only confirmed her suspicions. The game had arrived at its limit. It was now. Either I lied or admitted that I had already let it go too far. My head spun. I needed to think fast. My sister was in front of me, waiting for an answer. But the problem was that I didn't know what to say myself. If I denied it very strongly, she would suspect even more. If he hesitated, he would be practically confirming everything. You see something where you don't? I let out, trying to look offended. She kept staring at me without blinking. Then look in my eyes and tell me nothing happened. I opened my mouth and closed again. My silence was the worst possible answer. Her face hardened. She crossed her arms, took a deep breath, and insisted, I'll ask one more time. Is there anything happening between you and Daniel? My heart beat like a drum. My chest climbed and down, heavy. I could lie, say she was imagining things. But what if she already knew more than she was showing? Her gaze crossed me. She wanted a truth, but was I ready to give? My mind shouted that I should deny, cut any suspicion right there. But my body hesitated, and it was at this moment that I realized, any answer that, I would change everything. The choice was in my hands, and I just had one chance. The silence between me and my sister lasted a few seconds, but it seemed an eternity. My whole body was tense. I needed to answer, but any wrong word could destroy everything. I took a deep breath and let go. Do you really think I would do something like that? My voice came out firm, but inside, I trembled. She studied me for a moment, so she looked away. I just needed to be sure, he said, crossing his arms. She didn't seem totally convinced, but accepted my answer. For now, but Daniel. He didn't react so well. When I learned that I had denied everything, he was silent. Then he just laughed at his corner. So that's it? Do you pretend nothing happened? I swallowed hard. I didn't know what to say. It was better that way, I muttered, trying to convince myself. He shook his head and laughed, but it wasn't a fun laugh. It was a bitter laugh. You can pretend, but I know the truth. And he left the room without looking back. That night, he didn't look at me the same way. The game was over. But inside, something told me that the consequences of that story were still far from over. The days passed. Everything seemed to have returned to normal. At least that's what I tried to convince myself. My sister no longer touched the subject. Daniel not either. But the silence between us said more than any word could say. I wanted to believe this was over, that I had made the right decision. But every time I crossed Daniel around the house, felt something inside me that could not ignore. He too dot the way I looked at me. How I avoided spending too much time in the same environment as me. As if you knew that if you stayed, something could happen. But then came the surprise. One night when I was already lying down, I heard a knock on my bedroom door. My heart fired. I got up slowly and opened it. It was Daniel. "I just wanted to say goodnight, Aunt," he said, with a smile that carried more than simple words. I swallowed hard. "Good night, Daniel." I closed the door, leaned my back on it, and let out the air stuck in my lungs. Life tests us in unexpected ways. Sometimes the forbidden is not about what we can have, but what we choose to deny. And what haunted me was not what happened, but what almost happened, because certain wills never disappear. They just fall asleep, waiting for a new chance to wake. Life is full of unexpected moments of tests that put us against our own desires. What happened, or rather, what almost happened, changed everything forever. I followed my life, Daniel followed his. But that look, that tension in the air were never forgotten. The forbidden has a different taste that never disappears completely. Time has passed, but sometimes in the middle of the night, I would take remembering, asking myself, what would have happened if I had not retreated? And now I ask you, have you ever lived something like this? Have you ever felt the temptation to cross a limit you shouldn't? Have you ever had a moment where you knew your life could change in a second? If so, tell me in the comments. I want to know your story. And if you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next videos. Here, there are always stories that will mess with you. How far are you willing to go? We see each other in the next video.